Lecture 2, Liberalism Introduced.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, I'm going to introduce liberalism. I'm going to do this in the following way. I'm going to start by discussing the sort of disagreement that might take place at a dinner party, where people who've been at school together had got engaged in conversation and then moved to the area of politics. I'm then going to trace the way in which the kind of disagreements that you might find amongst such people relate to ideas that are to be found in the thought of some key figures in the history of liberalism. I'm going here to talk about John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. After exploring briefly some of their ideas, I'm going to see how those ideas and tensions between them serve to explain and to underpin current disagreements of the sort from which we started. Accordingly, then, let us imagine a dinner party. We're here in a setting where people who'd been at school together, at college together, had got together as a group for a kind of reunion. At the point when people had reached dessert, their talk moved from issues of catching up to issues of contemporary politics. And the talk perhaps turned to issues about welfare. And here one might well imagine a spirited disagreement taking place. On the one hand, there might have been some guy who became an Ivy League professor in the Northeast. He came out in this discussion as a defender of the welfare state. Within such a welfare state, he said, the rights of everyone would be respected. The rights not just of the powerful and the successful, but the rights of everyone would be respected. And what's more, within such a setting, people could develop themselves. People also could enjoy a certain kind of autonomy. They'd be free of a kind of groveling dependence. And he said, in order to get this, what you need in the background is a guarantee by government that if people can't manage these things by themselves, that they will get assistance from the government as a right. By way of contrast with this, there might be some other figure. If we're dealing with stereotypes, imagine the other figure is an entrepreneur from Palo Alto in California. She also stresses issues about rights. But here, her emphasis is on individual rights, including property rights, and including the right not to be taxed for the benefit of others' welfare. She, though, would stress that she's not against giving others a helping hand, but she sees this as being a matter of what she chooses to do with her hard-earned cash, rather than something that other people have got a right to. Indeed, she might stress that she gives to charities, but she does so in line with her own values and also in line with her ideas about what works. She says, look, I'm an accomplished businesswoman. I will only give to those outfits which explain both what their aims are, but also which explain that they're effective. They're called to account, just as a business might be. I give, but, she says, forcing her to give violates her rights and also leads to the continuation of government programs that she thinks are ineffective as well as ways of assisting people. She might say, by way of contrast with the first guy, that she's a conservative. But in fact, the two different positions, in a sense, derive from different strands within liberalism. Indeed, we'll look at this in the rest of the lecture. It will, I believe, be interesting in itself, but it will also serve to introduce certain key aspects of liberalism. What we're going to do in this context, as I mentioned, is to look at three key figures: John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill, and then we'll return to our more contemporary controversy. First then, John Locke. Who was he? He was English. He lived from 1632 to 1704. He was educated at Oxford, and he then left scholarly pursuits to work for a lord, Lord Shaftesbury, who was a politician at the time and a leading opponent of the King, Charles II. Charles II was kind of a source of big worry to Shaftesbury and other fellow-minded people. Why? Well, he appeared to be taking power away from Parliament, acting in a sense without parliamentary accountability, without getting the permission of Parliament in order to levy taxes. But they were also worried about him because he was a Catholic, or at least suspected of being such. Why, though, was that a big deal? Well, at the time, Catholicism wasn't just an issue of religion. From a British perspective, if someone was a Catholic, it meant that they were kind of aligned ideologically with European powers who were opposed to British ideas about liberty. The situation was a bit like someone who perhaps was a communist in the 1950s in the US, namely, that while they may be conscientious in their political views, people were suspicious of them because they seemed to be lined up with the powers elsewhere in the world, at that time the Soviet Union, which it was thought were going to call into question liberty in the US and in Western Europe. Very similar situation. Locke followed Shaftesbury, indeed, into political radicalism, and Locke's well-known political work, The Two Treatises of Government, was in effect a defense of liberty against the crown, against the king. What Locke was doing was appealing to natural rights, to liberty, and to acquire property. He was appealing too to a right to revolt. He had the view that if a king, say, started acting in ways that called people's rights into question, he could be hunted down like a dangerous wild animal. And indeed, the American Professor Ashcroft, who's a specialist on Locke, said these weren't just theoretical ideas in Locke. He wanted to claim that there was a practical application to them as well, and that Locke was tangled up in a plot, the so-called Rye House plot, on the king's life, basically attempting to kill the king. It was unsuccessful, and Locke didn't wait around. He moved off from the UK to the Netherlands and stayed there because he was afraid for his life. Indeed, there was another guy who had rather similar views to Locke, who also had a kind of involvement, who thought, no, I'd be perfectly safe. A guy called Algernon Sidney, and he was executed. So in this case, you've got someone who had theoretical ideas but put them into practice. Locke came back at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution. He returned to England and to his career in writing as a kind of professor, although he wasn't teaching, he was just writing and researching. What, though, you might say, is all this to us? Well, there are a number of themes in Locke that speak down, in a sense, to us in our own day. First of all, there's the notion of individual rights, that people shouldn't be interfered with, they shouldn't be coerced by other people, and that their property should be left intact as well. If they haven't broken any laws, if they've been behaving decently, then the government just can't come in and interfere with them. In addition, you get notions in Locke of people acquiring property rights by way of what he describes as mixing their labor with, say, land. You have this picture in Locke of people being able to acquire property not as a result of grant from the government, but if the property is unoccupied, essentially by putting it to productive use, the stuff then becomes theirs. The purpose of government itself is basically, from Locke's perspective, to protect such rights, to protect individuals and their property against other people aggressing on them. And indeed, these kinds of notions, that this is the purpose of government and that government itself shouldn't be aggressing against individual rights, including property rights, echoed right down through the American Revolution until today. It is, though, worth noting three further features to them. First of all, From today's perspective, I guess, the political aspects of Locke's approach look kind of firmer, more secure, more approachable, as it were, than Locke's own ideas about the foundations of these rights. In his own writings, it seems to me, there is a religious basis to rights. Why do you have rights? Well, from Locke's perspective, it is because you have duties to God and a requirement from God that you preserve yourself and other members of your own species as far as you can. This, I think, poses a kind of problem today for the person who is attracted by an approach like Locke's, which emphasizes individual rights, but who isn't a religious believer. Namely, what account does that person give of the foundation of such rights, of why people have them? Second, there are some issues relating to Locke's ideas about property. Locke's ideas about property were developed in England basically as part of an argument about the notion that there shouldn't be taxation without consent, that people have a right to own property independent of the will of the government. But these ideas, developed in that context, were then exported with settlers to North America and to Australia. And there they became, in a kind of interesting, rather disturbing way, the basis for an argument that hunter-gatherers who are to be found there didn't actually own the land on which they were hunting and gathering. All they were entitled to on Locke's account was certain limited property rights in the animals and so on that they'd hunted, not to the land itself. And what it became was a kind of ideology which offered a rationale for the dispossession of hunter-gatherers by labor-mixing farmers. So Locke, from that point of view, was really quite popular amongst some of the settlers in the US and in Australia. There is, in addition, a further kind of twist in Locke, namely that in the first treatise of government, he discusses the notion that people have a right to subsistence from the surplus of others. That's to say, if you're starving, other people can't, as it were, hold you over a barrel. Rather, they are obliged to help you out if they have got plenty and you haven't. And some people have said, well, there's a sense in which, in Locke, who in all other respects seems to be kind of more on the conservative side of things, there's a basis here for notions about welfare entitlements. Let me move from Locke to my second character in this story, Adam Smith. He was a Scot who lived in the 18th century. He was an economist, he's famous for the wealth of nations, but he's also well known as a philosopher. What is his significance for liberalism? Well, first of all, you have in Locke's work an emphasis on the theme, on Smith's work, an emphasis on the theme of rights. Indeed, it in some ways resembles Locke's approach, albeit on different foundations. Secondly, you have notions of rights as a basis for ideas about the development of wealth within commercial society. What you have in Smith's view is a picture of a legal regime informed by notions of rights, and within this, the division of labor taking place. Specialization, on Smith's account, leads to gains in productivity. If you split tasks up into small components and then recombine them, you can just produce a whole lot more than if one particular individual is attempting to accomplish an entire task. This, though, poses the question, how are these different tasks that are split into different parts coordinated? How do they all add up? Within a workshop, presumably, the owner or the works managers or whatever allocate different tasks to different people. In Smith's own account, he talked about the manufacture of pins, and the works manager would say, well, you have to make pin heads, you the shafts, you, and allocating the different tasks. Clearly, you wouldn't get productivity, even if people produced a whole lot of stuff, if these things weren't properly coordinated together. What you also get, though, in Smith's work is a notion of coordination taking place in society spontaneously. That's to say, you don't need in society someone playing the role of a works manager. Rather, you get this vision in Smith of economic self-interest and prices guiding people so that they determine what they're going to do in ways that fit together with other people. In a sense, if you're trying to make as much money as you can, if you're trying to put anything you own to the greatest productive use, if you're guided by prices, this, on Smith's account, will lead you into courses of action which fit in better with other people's plans than if you do something that gives only a small return. These offer some really key ideas for liberals. What are they? Well, you get a position where, as it were, there are two wings. On the one side, you get notions of the rights of individuals and them being respected, but you get compatible with this a view of social coordination and the production of wealth taking place in a way that's of benefit to all. Rights, but also a theory of how a society is going to work productively and in a way that everyone benefits from. You get, indeed, a theme in the work of John Locke, through Adam Smith, to the writings of a 20th century economic publicist, Leonard Read, who wrote a small piece called I Pencil. Take a pencil with an eraser on one end of it, a piece of metal, the pencil, and then there's the point of the pencil here. What Read says is consider all the different ingredients that come together in making up the pencil. The wood, the paint, the rubber eraser, the little metal thing that keeps it on, and so on. All of these are produced by different people who are led to cooperate not because they know their different tasks are going to go into the making of the pencil, but rather because they're following their self-interest and undertaking those activities that pay. And what you get from this perspective is a picture of a certain kind of social cooperation in society, people cooperating together, not knowing that they're cooperating, and indeed ending up cooperating with people who, if they actually met them, they might well dislike them and may not want directly to work together. Indeed, the 20th century economist Friedrich Hayek has offered a further twist to this particular picture. He talks about the way in which, within a society like ours, knowledge is divided, including tacit knowledge, knowledge that can't be centralized, the kind of know-how type of knowledge rather than factual information. And what Hayek wants to argue is that that kind of knowledge is spread out right across society, but that kind of knowledge typically can't be centralized, because if you've just got tacit knowledge, you can't really spell the thing out in such a way as to convey it all to someone else. And what Hayek wanted to argue is that this poses certain limits to the central planning of an economy, but that he wanted to say it can be made use of in social situations by people who are guided by prices. And so this kind of vision that Smith has, he applies also to the use of knowledge in society. All of this then starts to offer a picture of how a liberal society works. And indeed, notions about rights, notions about coordination are within liberalism then supplemented by notions of private and charitable activity. People will have particular connections with members of their family, people with whom they identify, who they may want to help out, but also, say, if there's some disaster, then people may offer disaster relief. And what you get from this perspective is a kind of picture of how such a society functions. Just in the case of Locke, it is also, though, worth making a couple of concluding comments about Smith. First of all, it's worth noting that in Smith's work, while he talked about the huge gains in productivity that come from the advanced division of labor, he also talked about the way in which it had some costs. Namely, that if you are doing something like, making a tiny part of a pin or a tiny part of a button every day, they're going to be costs of two sorts. It may, on the one side, mean that your body becomes badly affected. We're now familiar with the strains that come from repeating some small operation over and over again. Smith was on to that and thought that people may find that they're crippled as a result of this sort of activity. He also said that, look, if people are concentrating on some small task all the time, the result may be that they're stupid, that they may really not be able to have a sensible conversation about anything, although what Smith wanted to say is these people will typically be wealthy, better off than they were before, but that it will have this kind of debilitating effect on them. Another kind of twist in Smith is that, as compared to Locke, Smith doesn't want a kind of guaranteed right to subsistence underwritten by the government. I mean, basically, Smith's view is that as wealth is generated within market-based societies, and as markets in commodities develop, you can really leave those people who fall through the into the bottom of things, people who can't make a living, really to charity. You don't need to have a kind of regulatory regime in place which guarantees to them that they have subsistence to a particular kind of level. And indeed, what Smith wanted to argue was this, that he thought that getting rid, just physically as it were, of problems of famine required that one loosened up various sorts of markets. And in order to do this, you needed, in his view, to get rid of the old regulatory structures which at the time, for example, limited the movement of grain from one place to another, just because in the event of famine, the grain would become something that, in a sense, the poor people had a right to. And so what Smith's view was that markets could, and then charity could look after these things together, provided that you got rid of regulation. Let me turn now to the third of our characters, John Stuart Mill. He was English, he lived from 1806 to 1873, and he's best known really for his defense of liberty. Intellectually, he's a kind of interesting character, because as a youngster he was sort of force-fed with knowledge by his father, who was a follower of the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Who was Bentham? Well, he's best known for the doctrine of utilitarianism. This is the idea that one should assess institutions and laws and constitutions and reform them on the basis of what leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. What counts? Well, he's almost notorious for having said, look, what really counts is pleasure. And it's the intensity of pleasure and the duration of pleasure and so on that matters. And in this context, pushpin, which is a kind of simple child's game, is as good as poetry. What really counts is which gives you the more pleasure and the more intense pleasure. You don't get a sort of special rating given to pleasure from poetry, the kind of higher things, as opposed to pleasure that you get from more gross things. He was highly critical of the notion of natural rights. He thought notions of natural rights were nonsense on stilts, just complete rubbish. In his view, you had to have recourse instead to ideas about utility and happiness and so on. All of this became the background for the young John Stuart Mill. And he was fed these ideas, he was trained in languages and classical studies and economics, but the poor little chap didn't have any poetry in his life. And indeed, he was formed very much in this particular model and became a radical reformer. He was arrested at one point as a youngster for passing out information about birth control to the working class. All of this, though, led him to a kind of personal crisis and a breakdown. I think he's someone to whom poetry really mattered, and he didn't get any of it. He had this kind of breakdown, and in the course of this, he came under the influence, amongst other people, of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the Romantic poets, and he also became open to a wide range of different intellectual ideas. The result of this was that he offered, in later life, a kind of modified version of utilitarianism. He stressed the idea that from utilitarian foundations one could make a case for the importance of individual liberty. Indeed, he argued for the importance of individual liberty in a way that's more akin to the manner in which people associated with ideas about rights would do so, but he provided arguments for this on the basis of utility. How did he do it? Well, one of the things that he said is, look, if your concern is with people's happiness, with well-being, then individuals take decisions for themselves rather than having to depend on other people to decide for them. Why? Well, basically because you know your own tastes and your own preferences best. If someone says to you, what would you like for lunch? Then you are going to know this typically better than do other people. So if you're interested in people's well-being, give them the power to make the decisions. He also stressed the importance of autonomy and of self-development. Not only, he thought, does it lead to the greatest kind of satisfactions in people's lives, but he also said, look, you should tolerate oddballs. Why? Well, because they may come up with things which are useful to the rest of you, with discoveries and so on. He also is well known for having put forward an argument for toleration, for the notion that you shouldn't suppress unpopular opinions, but he bases this argument on the view that our knowledge is fallible, that we can't be certain that we're right. This, I think probably works with regard to factual knowledge, say general scientific knowledge and things of this kind, although I'm not sure that it has all the consequences that Mill thinks follow from this idea. This is a notion we'll be exploring in one of the later lectures. But I think there is more of a problem if you look at this in the context of religious belief, because typically people claim certainty with regard to their religious beliefs, that they've been saved or whatever, and this, I think, doesn't fit very well with Mill's appeals to the notion that our knowledge is fallible. Mill's views as a whole, I think, are somewhat complex, and their legacy is a bit ambiguous. Some later writers, for example, the British writer T.H. Green, argued, following Mill in a sense, that self-development is so important that really you can base notions of an entitlement to welfare rights on such a basis, and indeed that there should be governmental intervention, if necessary, to provide what each person needs in order to develop themselves. So, this is a quick tour through some of the big figures in the history of liberalism. Let us from this turn back to our dinner party and the controversies there. What we had were clearly two different views being put forward about welfare, and there was argument that was taking place, but we can now locate it as being both about the character of liberalism and also argument between different liberals. Each of the parties, the professor and the entrepreneur, showed a certain concern for human rights and human flourishing, and they appealed to different aspects of the liberal tradition. The modern law, welfare liberal, the professor, appealed to notions about rights to subsistence and ideas about self-development, which he'd want to take beyond Mill and Green to offer them as a basis for a welfare state. The classical liberal, the entrepreneur, stressed themes that you find in Smith and other aspects of Locke's work on rights. Our selective history has thus looked at some common elements between these people, but it's also posed problems about what these different views now amount to. You may say, okay, you can look at these things in historical terms, but what, in effect, does this amount to now? What does the argument between these people look like on an ongoing basis, not just a historical basis? And indeed, this is the very thing we'll be considering in the next two lectures. Let me turn here to remind you just what it is that's happened in this lecture. First of all, we started from the dinner table. We started from a group of friends who'd been together at school with one another, who'd then come together for a reunion and got involved in a controversy about politics, in which we analyzed particularly two different perspectives, ones which will be very familiar to you. We then moved back from this to show the way in which these disagreements relate to elements within the liberal tradition, upon which, consciously or unconsciously, they're drawing. And in this context, we considered notions from John Locke and Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. If you recall in this context, notions about rights in Locke, but also a right to subsistence. The conception in Smith of rights fitting together with ideas about how a society can flourish and how people can do well within it as a result of the division of labor and the social coordination of these people's efforts. We looked also very briefly at John Stuart Mill, and in that context, we looked at the way in which he developed arguments for individual freedom, not depending, as did Locke and Smith, on notions of rights, but on ideas from the utilitarian tradition, and at the way in which, too, you get ideas not just about liberty, but also ideas about toleration being put forward, a notion which also comes to play a key role within the liberal tradition. And indeed, this historical survey then led us back to wider questions about liberalism. For clearly, the kind of issues that we've looked at briefly, the ones that came up in the dinner table, are not just things that can be illuminated if we turn back to history, but they are also matters about which people are in passionate debate today. And we're going to pursue these matters in the next 2 lectures. In the lecture that follows immediately, I'm going to explore different aspects of liberalism. What, in a sense, makes it tick? How does it really work? And in the lecture after that, I'm going to pursue these 2 different interpretations of liberalism, to see what makes them tick and to see what the different arguments are on one side or the other. To try, that's to say, to see what on the one side classical liberalism amounts to, and on the other welfare liberalism, and where the balance of the argument between them might lie. Thank you very much.